Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the second in our webinar series on patient data licensing. My name is Kirsten Loita, and I'm a partner at Osage University Partners, leading our university relations efforts. I'll be in the background for most of today as we have a terrific panel joining us. Go to the next slide, including our guest moderator. I'll have each of the people joining us introduce themselves, then I'll do a bit of housekeeping before passing the baton to Gavin. Alan, as our guest moderator, will you introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Alan Bentley here from Vanderbilt University moderating today. I'll be asking our panelists all the very tough questions. There were some questions that were sent ahead of time. We have those teed up for the end of the session here. And if anybody has any questions to ask during the session, please use the Q&A function. Do not use the chat. We'll be monitoring the Q&A function. So help me God, if someone uses the chat, we'll be okay, but please try to use the Q&A. So I'll pass it off to our panelists to start. Gavin Foltz from Duke University.
Thank you. Gavin Foltz from Duke University School of Medicine. I lead the contracts office responsible for supporting industry-funded contracts at Duke. And important to note, while if you've noticed, I am a JD, I do not represent Duke in a legal capacity. That is counsel's office. So I am functioning today as a contracts person rather than a lawyer.
And John.
I am John Plummer. I am the interim director of the Office of Contracts Management at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And I am a contracts guy too, not a lawyer at all.
Great. Well, thank you, Alan, Gavin, and John. We'll go to the next slide. I'm really looking forward to today's session. We just have some housekeeping items before we get to the meat of today. So just to remind everyone, this webinar is the second in a series of webinars that we're having on patient data licensing. The first one was from January. It was on what is the data. You can find a recording of it on YouTube. Today is obviously what can we do with the data itself. And then the third one that we had planned is how are academic institutions licensing patient data. That will be in May. And we'll have panelists Stephen Gardner of Quarles and Brady and Angela Kujak of the Broad Institute. And then we've added two more on data licensing case studies. We're looking for the date for this. We have a couple of panelists already set up for that. And then a Q&A session, because we've had so many questions throughout this series that some of the questions haven't been addressed so far in our series, and we may not get to some of the questions because they were outside of the original scope. So we're planning on a Q&A session also later this year. So keep a lookout for those particular dates. FYI, we're not offering CLE credit for today's webinar, but we should be able to do for the third webinar in our series. Let's go to the next slide. All right, the slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on OUP's partner portal, and a recording will also be available via our YouTube channel. We will also be sending out the slides to everyone who registered for this webinar, as well as sending the link. For those of you who know our partner portal, it's an online portal for the tech transfer officers and researchers at our partner universities of OUP, and it's full of relevant tech transfer and startup content. Happy to tell you more about that if you have any questions. As Alan mentioned, we really do encourage questions throughout the webinar. He'll be monitoring them, asking them appropriately as they come up. Some of them may be answered in subsequent webinars. We'll let you know if that's the case itself. So please do use that Q&A toolbox that he mentioned. Next slide. A short intro of OUP. For those of you who don't know us, we're a venture capital fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising the participation rights available through their licenses. As part of this partnerships, the institutions share in our profits and receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups, such as this webinar. We're now on our fourth fund, investing out of that, and we've made investments in over 130 different companies in all areas of deep science, and many of those companies have had successful exits either through IPOs or mergers, acquisitions, et cetera. The next slide, if we go to that, shows some of the portfolio companies and the breadth of areas that we invest in, and we're always happy to talk about our model. But we know that you are here for the subject of today, which is patient data licensing. And with that, I will pass it over to Gavin and go to the next slide to get to the meat of today. Gavin.
Thank you, Kirsten. So to start with, I'd like to set the stage for the presentation. As you notice, John and I are both from medical institutions, so from the medical center and then the School of Medicine, and we're both from contracts offices. So the general focus today will be on research contracting. The presentation will focus on the various projects that we might find presented to our offices and how we analyze those particular projects. Next slide, please. So for the agenda, we thought a good linear way to analyze a proposed project, in most circumstances, is just to ask the basic questions: who, what, why, when, where. And we distilled that down to, the four components of today's presentation. And that is, what does the researcher want to do? Can we do what the researcher wants to do? If we can do it, should we? And then if we should do it, then how would we accomplish the goals and move forward with that particular project? So that's the agenda, and we'll take each of those in sequence. After a few other slides, we'll get to that. So next slide, please. So there is a disclaimer today. Data use is so complicated that it's very difficult to try to address all components of that in an hour presentation with two contracts guys. You'd need a panel and a much longer seminar for that. So this presentation is intended to generate thought and discussion, because there are just too many variables to give you a prescribed approach about data use in general, and or to give you any specific guidance on your particular situation. So once again, this is to generate thought and discussion and to illuminate the things that you'll need to address with your stakeholders at your institution, considering the facts that you have on your plate at the time. I do strongly urge you to watch the first presentation. These presentations are intertwined, but without a doubt, this one builds on the data or the information that Nick and David provided in the first presentation on the definition of data, the subject matter, the nature of the data, and then also the laws, rules, regulations that affect our ability to transfer and use data. So once again, I do strongly suggest that you look at that. Next slide, please. So the start of the vetting process is normally a submission of a data use or transfer request. And that can come in a number of different ways. It could be a phone call or an email from a PI. It could be a data intake form that the institution has implemented. But we characterize these requests in two main categories, or two characterizations. One is all buttoned up and they just need a contract. And then one is figuring out the puzzle. And the key is to get the facts and realize that the facts change. And they change either because the deal changes, the research changes, or they change because as you dig further into the fact-finding mission, you'll uncover things that weren't apparent at the start. So, when we talk about all buttoned up and just need a contract, I think John would agree, we don't see that too often, where a researcher
virtually never. If I see it, I worry that the other is underneath it.
Well, that's right. So what happens, a PI a researcher can come to you and say, I need a data use agreement because I want to transfer a limited data set. It's 10 films of a shoulder. I'm going to send it to my academic colleague at X university. They're going to contribute to the analysis, and then we're going to publish. I've talked to the IRB already. I talked to my IT department on transfer of the films. We're going to do it in box. Talk to my chair, everyone's lined up, and I just need a data use agreement for this limited data set. We don't get that very often. What we get, and I'll shorten the dramatization of this, but what we get is someone that comes to us and says, hey, I need your help. I got here about 6 months ago. I was at X university. I showed up with 5 zip sticks in my pocket with all this great data. Half of it's from me from the NIH project at my prior institution. Half of it's from a colleague of mine who was sponsored by Pfizer or some other industry sponsor for their research component. I collected all the data here. I gave the point of care device that we're researching to a friend of mine who took it overseas and used it. I don't think there was an ethics board approval, but the data is really good, so we're really excited about it. We need to send all the data to a third party to validate the technology. Can you help? Right? And so that's a dramatization, but those are things that you could get. And the key is to dig and find out the facts, because those are going to dictate what the landscape is at your institution for vetting those particular projects. Next slide, please. So there is a difference among the uses. Generally, we break those down into 3 uses. Research use is generally for the contribution to the science. So if you are transferring or using data for a systematic investigation for the development of generalizable knowledge, right? That's a research use. A transfer to another party to provide a good or service would be a vendor use. And then licensing is for another party's independent use. So you're not involved, or the provider's not involved. They send the data somewhere else for that use. And at most AMCs, and I know at Duke and Vanderbilt, at least those 3 different uses are handled by 3 different offices. And that's why it's important to identify the use up front so that you get the relevant stakeholders as soon as possible. Research at most AMCs is handled by either a research contracts office or a sponsored program office. Vendor use is normally handled by a procurement or supply chain office. And then licensing is handled by a tech transfer office. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be helpful just to give a visual depiction of the components, when you're vetting your projects. And these are, rules that we have to comply with and offices that help us comply with those rules. So, the Belmont report at the very top, that's the basis for ethical treatment of research subjects. And then springing from the Belmont report is the common rule. The common rule technically is applicable to federally funded or supported or conducted research, human subject research, but most AMCs apply the common rule to all research at their institution, human subject research at their institution. So even if it's not federally supported, you may still have to deal with the common rule. Of course, we have HIPAA, GDPR, and state laws that govern how data can be used and accessed. You may involve your security office if you have issues on how the data will be transferred and secured. Obviously, contracts offices to memorialize the agreement between the parties. The privacy office is engaged to make sure that we are in compliance with HIPAA, GDPR, and various state laws. Tech transfer, if the deal or project ends up being a license, a transfer of technology rather than a research project or a vendor agreement. And then to the extent it's identifiable data that is then characterized as human subject research, then your IRB will be involved. And in a lot of AMCs, IRBs even govern the use and transfer of de-identified data. So that will be up to your particular institution. So this is not intended to be a true Venn diagram. It's just a depiction of the parties that may be involved at your institution. And I'm not aware of any institution where any one of these offices or a single office would have unilateral authority or have in their wheelhouse the complete responsibility for determining when something like this, when data could be used. And you can subtract or add circles as appropriate for your institution. Yeah. You could
legal,
add FDA.
International offices for if it's an international data transfer, all kinds of folks.
Right. So you could add your legal office if that's appropriate for your institution. You could add the FDA if you're doing clinical research under an IND. But these, once again, just to stimulate thought and help understand what the landscape's like and the parties that could be involved in vetting the projects at your institution. Next slide, please. So as an example, at Duke, the normal offices to start with would be the researcher, the principal investigator, the IRB, contracts office, and then a mix of privacy and compliance offices to make sure that we're complying with the relevant regulations on data use and transfer. Most of the time, we can satisfy our requirements to move forward with those discussions. If we get to the point where we're really not sure if it's something that we can do or want to do, then we will submit the project to a data licensing committee. And that has representatives from the various offices and responsibilities that are listed here. And then we will actually discuss the project and oftentimes invite the investigator to come to the committee to explain to us what the proposed project is. So then we can discuss it and make sure that we're all aligned on either moving forward or not. And there are some cases where we have declined to move forward with a proposed project. And the issue there is it's spotting the red flags and the issues that all of our offices need to think about to, once again, to make sure that we're aligned. Next slide, please. And John, I'll let you take this one.
The picture at Vanderbilt is, or the medical center at Vanderbilt is somewhat similar. It's a little bit more formal on the front end. When the PI submits their online request to our office, the online request includes a fairly detailed risk assessment questionnaire that they have to fill out that includes things like the number of records, the type of entity that the data is going to. Is it a brand new startup? Is it a established university? Will the data be transferred to a third party beyond the initial recipient? What is the mode of transfer? All different types of factors, and those factors reduced to a numeric score. And if the contract analyst looks at it and sees that they've got a high numeric score, they try to work with the investigator and the department to see if there's anything that could reduce the risk. Maybe they could shift dates. Maybe they don't really need to transfer certain data fields that they were thinking about. And if they still have a high score, then it goes to a committee, very much like the one that Gavin just described, with stakeholder offices. Alan participates in that committee to evaluate the particular situation and make a business decision. And if it goes even further than that, then there's an executive committee that it could go to. Most things are solved at the level of what we call the contracts optimization committee. So next slide. Back to you, Gavin.
Yeah, thanks, John. So John's email is going to blow up after this slide presentation for everyone wanting to know how they do the numerical score. I think that's a great idea.
Deep secrets, Gavin.
Yeah, there is a question. Is it shareable? Is that a proprietary Vanderbilt thing?
That is a proprietary VMC thing, I'm afraid. So.
Okay.
I will say that I've explored that just in the initial phases, and it's a daunting task. So I applaud Vanderbilt for doing that.
It's a work in progress. It keeps being refined.
Right. So absent any numerical scoring, most institutions do have an intake form for information gathering, and Duke has that, and it's a robust form. It's multiple pages, lots of questions. And it's important, once again, to make sure that you gather the facts. The type of information that you may collect on an intake form that you'd want to collect would be the proposed use, once again, to establish the relevant offices and the direction of the analysis, whether or not it's a transfer or access. And this is really, transfer or access is really a data security issue, because from a HIPAA perspective or disclosure perspective, if you provide access, you've transferred the data, right? So here we're talking about physical transfer versus access, so that your data security offices can weigh in and make sure that the data is processed accordingly. You'd want to know the direction of the data flow, whether it's one way or two way, is it incoming or outgoing, to make sure that you approach it in the correct manner. The provenance of the data is important. Is it standard of care data versus research data? And that is important because you'll need to understand whether there are upstream obligations or restrictions on that data. So for instance, for standard of care, it depends on what the surgical or treatment informed consent form may say, and your institution's policy or practice on use of standard of care data in other ways. And then from a research perspective, if the research was funded by a commercial entity, then most certainly that contract would have restrictions on how that data can be used in the future, if at all. And we'll get to some of that a little bit later, but certainly you'd want to understand the provenance of the data. The method of transfer and access, once again, this is a security issue to make sure that the data is handled appropriately. So is it box, RedCap, flash drive? Do they show up with it in their pocket, or is it coming through a more formal method? And then importantly is a checklist of which of the 18 identifiers are expected to be transferred. I think everyone has had the occasion where innocently someone has said the data is de-identified, but in fact, when you dig, you understand that it's not de-identified. And so you'll need to make provisions to protect that information differently than had it been. And with that, this is setting the stage for what does the research want to do. It's a fact-finding mission to line up the appropriate offices, to ask the questions and feel comfortable with the projects that are being proposed. So once you ask the question, what does the researcher want to do, and you've answered that, then the next question is, well, can we do what the researcher wants to do? And we'll talk about that. Let me go to the next slide, please. So setting the stage for that, can we do it? Well, that's going to fall on the different offices, and it depends on whether something is a service. Once again, that'll go to well, if it's outgoing, so you are sending data to a service provider, then it's probably going to go to your procurement or supply chain. If it's incoming and you're going to provide a service to another party, if you're a 501c3 institution, you may have some mission-related and unrelated business income tax issues to deal with. I know that there are some institutions that, as a policy, don't provide services to other institutions because of the UBIT. So you'll need to consider that. If it's a commercial use of an institutional asset, so if the data is retrospective data that's held in a health system, and that's going to be licensed out, you may or may not be able to do that depending on the facts, and then that would be something that would go to your tech transfer office, most probably. And then lastly, in John's world and my world, in the 501c3 mission world, if the proposed use is research or education in furtherance of science, then we would handle that, and that's something that we would try to make happen. For some granularity, there is a little bit of difference with standalone projects. If you have a standalone research project, it's easy to identify the discrete and narrow purpose of that particular project. So it's easier to protect and handle the data accordingly. It's a little bit harder in registries. Once you've donated or contributed the data to that registry, then how do you affect downstream control? And so it's going to be really important in those situations to review your contracts carefully to make sure that you're providing for the downstream management of that data. So now that's all the what the researcher wants to do and the different buckets that would normally contain the proposed uses. And now we'll turn it over to John to discuss, can we do what the researcher wants to do?
Hey, Gavin, can I jump in with a real quick question that came up a couple of times? The question about having a review form to score these requests. The VMC form John mentioned was proprietary. Does Duke use a formal form like this as well, or is it more informal, and do you have a proprietary approach to it?
So we do not have a numerical score form. We have a data intake form that asks all the pertinent questions, but we do not assign a numerical value. As far as I'm concerned, my form is not proprietary, so I'm happy to share that at some point. Okay.
And John, can you give 2 or 3 examples of items that would cause a high score or a concerning score that you look out for?
Sure. One of the most common is a really large number of records being transferred, or international situations. Let me think, what's another really common one? An unusual recipient on the other side, like a small place that maybe doesn't have data security at the level that we would typically expect. But I think the most common one that lands things in the optimization meeting is a large number of records.
How about identified versus de-identified? Is that a factor?
Well, it is, yeah. And depending on what identifiers are in the data and what kind of sensitive information might be also included, those can push the score up. But what they most typically do is that they push the people to the core that evaluates whether it's de-identified or not to make sure that it is, and it gets solved in that realm.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so now now that we know what our investigator wants to do, can we actually do this? In the world that Gavin and I live in, most of this data is going to be governed by HIPAA. And so under the HIPAA definitions, we want to know if this is going to be PHI, if it's going to be a limited data set, if it's going to be a de-identified. So how do we know this? I'm sure that any of us who work in this world have always had investigators who in all good faith say, hey, this is completely de-identified. And you look at it and you're like, nope, here are dates of service. Here's like things that could easily fit under identifier number 18, other information that you could uniquely identify an individual. And so who does this? And different institutions have come up with different solutions. At Vanderbilt University Medical Center, we have a core set up that if you want to transfer data that you're classifying as de-identified or a limited data set, it goes to this core for them to look at the data and either agree with you or coach you on how to get it there. It's just been found that that kind of expert review, which goes beyond what the contract office can do, is necessary to make sure that we get it right. So next slide.
John, I just want to make one comment.
Sure.
Most people think of de-identifying data. The easiest is to strip the 18 HIPAA identifiers, right? But there's also the expert determination that some institutions use, and that's it's outside my area of expertise, but it is another method to de-identify data.
Right. And so no matter what kind of data is, we want to be sure that we completely understand what we're dealing with. Like, are we dealing with PHI or a limited data set under HIPAA? Are we dealing with some other form of personally identifying information? Are we dealing with data that would be deemed identifiable under the GDPR or other international laws, which is different from the US standards in some, like, for instance, genomic data is definitely identifiable there, more questionably in the US, although it seems to be tilting that way. What does the informed consent and or the HIPAA authorization, which are separate but often are found in the same spot, what do they allow? What do our state laws allow? In Tennessee, for instance, we have a state law which prohibits offshoring of data involving TennCare patients unless the state agrees to let us do it, which any patient population at VUMC is probably going to have TennCare patients in it. So we bump into that one periodically. So we just, again, this is more fact finding, like what laws govern the data in question? Which categories does the data exactly fall into? So next slide. Images are another area of trouble at times. Just a plain flat image with nothing on it, which doesn't always seem to happen too often, would not necessarily be PHI. It is very hard to de-identify some types of images. And here again, different institutions have different approaches to how to confirm de-identification of an image. VUMC has again taken the approach of having a specific core image VU that looks at any images that want to be that an investigator wants to transfer outside of the medical center to confirm that they have been appropriately de-identified before they go anywhere. So next slide. Once we understand the type of data we've got, the sort of laws that it may be subject to, then we have to look at our institutional policies and practices to see if we can do it within our own rules. Duke doesn't perform services, VUMC does. We do some UBIT work. If we have an investigator who's proposing something that starts to look like UBIT, we will often refer the department to our tax office to take a look at it and let them know and what their departmental responsibilities would be in that case. Commercial use of data is a whole other realm of topic and probably beyond what we want to get into today, but maybe that will come up in some of the future sessions of this series.
Yeah.
So
John,
yep.
Just one point on the selling of patient data. Yep. So if we're talking about the patient data, if it's de-identified, then it's outside of HIPAA.
Right.
So from a HIPAA perspective, you could actually sell the data. If it's identifiable data, you can't sell the data under HIPAA, but you can recoup cost to prepare the data for transfer.
That is,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, but whether it's de-identified or not, there is a sensitivity and aversion at most academic medical centers to outright selling patient data. So
just something that would look like what, like you're selling my data. Why did I give you my data and now you're doing this? You're making money off of this. Yes, of course.
Right.
But it is a good point that increasingly we have data use agreements that include payment terms and recouping cost of preparing the data in specific ways, transferring it in specific ways, and that is more and more common.
Right, and it is important to make sure if you have compensation terms in a data transfer agreement, that if you're not intending to sell the data, make sure that the compensation is in line with what it really costs to get it ready for transport or transmission. And I'm just going to throw out a figure. It's probably not realistic to get $250,000 under a data transfer agreement, right? At that point, you're selling data, and it is what it is, despite you saying that you're just recouping your costs, not at $250,000, right?
No, not at all.
Okay.
All right, next slide. So obviously for a lot of these forms of data, IRB review and approval is important. Every institution has ways in which the contracts office and the IRB interface. In our world, our databases actually talk to one another. So the IRB tends to give a provisional approval on the front end, and then our database triggers theirs when we indicate that the contract language is final, even if the agreement's not executed, and they can move that forward to a final approval. When difficult projects come to the optimization meeting that we were mentioning earlier, the IRB is part of that meeting, and often there will be direction given to the IRB like, okay, this project can go forward, but in the consent, it needs to be sure to say the following things so that proper consent has been given, the patient's fully aware of things that could impact them. And is there a method of ensuring PI compliance? Ultimately, compliance in these matters lands with the PI and the PI's department. And so we try to be very, very sure that the PI has seen and has electronically approved or signed off on the final version of the contract and has indicated that they've read it. Because they are the ones who are going to have to obey its terms. They're the ones who need to know, I can only use the data for this. I have to destroy the data after this time frame. I have to return the data in this way. They need to be fully on board with it, and all we can do is make them aware of the requirements and hope that they do what they need to do. Next slide. And it's back to you, Gavin, with now that we know that we can, assuming we decided that we can, should we?
Hey, Gavin, just a couple quick follow-up questions that are coming in based on what we just went over. First off, one for you. You had mentioned that there are multiple ways of de-identifying data, the safe harbor method and the expert determination. When you do the expert determination method, who's responsible for that? Is that something that you contract with an outside party, or is that something that you do with an internal expert?
Yeah, Alan, that's not my area of expertise, but I believe that Duke would use an external party to do the expert determination.
Okay,
yeah.
John, is that the same answer for Vanderbilt?
That would be the same answer for us.
Okay, and just one quick follow-up question. In terms of John, you had mentioned an internal process for assessing whether something is de-identified. Who makes up the group that does that, and where do they live within the institution?
They live inside the overall Office of Research. They are a core that does other types of data work as well as this sort of assessment. They also are heavily interwoven with IT security universe within VUMC. And there again, our various systems talk to one another. The department, when they're submitting something to us, has to submit to them as well and enter their code into our intake form so that we know how to follow up and make sure that it's been approved before we finalize anything.
Thank you.
And then, Alan, I'll add that at our institution, we also have a separate office that's responsible for a number of responsibilities regarding or surrounding clinical research. And that's the office that handles the de-identification and then certification that it's de-identified. The point there being that at Vanderbilt and Duke, neither of us leave it to the PI to determine whether something's de-identified. And that's not cynical. It's just, it's a belt and suspenders approach, and just to make sure that we're complying with the relevant laws.
I don't think the investigators have ever seen a set that's not de-identified. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So, we all know just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And that was even talked about in the presentation that Nick and David did. So, should we do what the researcher wants to do? And one of the first things that we would ask ourselves is whether it's beneficial to the institution. So is it mission related? Does it further our education and research mission? Does it bring income to the institution? And is that the primary driver here? It may or may not be. Does it help build relationships? And we add that to the slide to say that in a lot of instances that doesn't carry the day. Right. So if your researcher says, well, I'd like to send this data to this other entity so that I can get my foot in the door and perhaps do some other exciting things with them, we would look to recharacterize that purpose and negotiate contract terms so that we get some sort of analysis back or data back or something that's of interest to us from a research perspective, and then turn that building relationship purpose into a mission purpose, and therefore it's now of great benefit to the institution. We definitely want to consider the ethical considerations. What is the general expectation of your subjects and patients, and what does the informed consent form and/or HIPAA authorization say? I know there's been a lot of discussion over the past 5 to 10 years about use of de-identified data that isn't spelled out in an informed consent form or a HIPAA authorization. So one could argue that you're not in violation because you're not using identifiable data. But then some people point out that the consent that the subject gave doesn't allow even the commercial use or other use, expanded use of their de-identified data. So that's something to think about at your institution, and certainly would be a conversation with your IRB. And then linked to the general expectations of subjects and patients is reputational risks. If you violate the trust of your subjects, that's not a good thing. If it comes out, it's certainly damaging. And it's also damaging not just in the newspapers for the general public, but certainly in our field of science and education. So we take those things very seriously. So we would look at those three things and help guide us on whether we should move forward with a particular proposed project. Next slide, please. So other considerations that are undertaken is one is, asset protection. Is the proposed project using prospective data versus retrospective data? If it's prospective data, and we'll get to this in the contracts piece, that's sponsored by an outside organization, most of the times they will have broad use rights over the data. That's different than retrospective data that is most of the time standard of care data. And in that case, as we've talked about in the prior slides, that's an asset of the institution, and we would want to make sure that we're getting an adequate return on use or transfer of that asset. And we have had instances where outside organizations come in and propose research projects that once we examine the proposed project more carefully, it's uncovered that really the protocol is broader than it needs to be regarding data use, because they are essentially mining our data. So we pay attention closely to the asset protection and exercise due care with our standard of care data. As John mentioned earlier, the volume of data is an important piece of the puzzle. If it's a narrow pool versus a wide data mining pool, those are two different things. 10 subjects versus 10,000 obviously makes a difference. And we take that under consideration when we're determining how and if and should we move into a particular project. And then the nature of the data, right? So this goes back to the intake form and collecting the information. If there are quantifiable data points that are assigned values and everything, that's one thing. If it's free text where people can enter in the data, that's something different from a protection perspective. And then also the quality of the data can vary depending on those differences. So these are the things that we think about from a should we do it perspective. Is it of benefit? Are we protecting our data, protecting our valuable assets? And going back to the Belmont, the number one principle in the Belmont report is respect of persons. And we take that very seriously here when we consider should we do something or not. So at this point then, if your researcher wants to do something and you've determined that you can do it, and then you've gone through this analysis of we should do this project, then we get to how do we do it? And with that, I'll turn that back over to John.
So there are many different, so the next slide, yeah, there we go. There are many different instruments that we can use to accomplish the how once we've decided that we can and we should. It might be a full-blown sponsored research agreement with varying terms, depending on if it's sponsor-initiated, investigator-initiated, which would make a huge difference in who gets what kind of data rights. It might be a collaboration agreement between academic institutions. We get a lot of submissions for so-called data use agreements that once we dig into them a bit, we discover that what's really needed is a research collaboration agreement because, for instance, it's prospective collection of data going into the future according to a particular protocol. It's like, no, that's more than a data use agreement. We have quite a few of those. Next slide. And then data transfer or use agreements proper. Data use agreement is defined in HIPAA for an agreement transferring a limited data set with only those very limited particular data fields. But in common parlance, I think most of us use data use agreement to mean whatever type of agreement whatever type of data we're transferring, whether it's full-blown PHI, whether it's de-identified. Data use, it's just become the common word for these things. Many institutions, including Vanderbilt University Medical Center, use the FDP's data transfer and use agreement template, which is great. We use it primarily with academic partners, not with industry, but its terms are broadly agreeable. It has different attachments. One attachment if it's PHI beyond a limited data set, one for an LDS, one for de-identified data. There are some circumstances like international situations where it needs to be altered, but for standard domestic transfers, it's been super useful for us. It is available on the FDP's website if you're not familiar with it. We might need a BAA to transfer data if it's related to a service agreement. Between a HIPAA covered entity and its business associate. In my world, those primarily live in the sourcing or supply chain office. We have very few of these. I think we've got a couple with the state of Tennessee where we're performing a type of a public health service, but they're much more common in the vendor world. And then thinking about sale of data, payment for transmission of data, which we talked about before, or a licensing agreement, which would be in Alan's tech transfer world. So next slide. There are many terms that you would need to think about no matter what agreement type you're using to transfer your data. And as Gavin said at the very beginning of the presentation, all of these situations are so varied and so complex that we cannot give you concrete guidance on your particular situations. There's just too much variation, but we can just point in a suggestive way toward the type of things that you might want to think about. For instance, the other party might not be a covered entity under HIPAA, and so therefore you might need to think about, do you want to bind them to protect the data in certain ways that they might not otherwise be obligated to do under HIPAA? Next slide. Again, what phase is a study in? Is this investigator initiated? Is it sponsor initiated? And what is the type of use of data that corresponds to the sort of agreement that you're dealing with? You don't want to give away the farm when it's inappropriate, and you don't want to unduly restrict things either. Next.
Yeah, John, just
jump in.
Quick point there. Because we're in contract negotiation offices, it's usually the first example when we're enrolling, and this is, I've discussed it with colleagues across the country, when we are an enrolling site in a sponsored phase 3 clinical trial, right? At that point, the informed consent form of the contract normally gives the sponsor broad rights. We are seeing an increasing difficulty in our investigator-initiated studies where we are trying to protect our data, it's our science, and the appropriate return on investment from the sponsor would be the results of the study, but we increasingly see them trying to negotiate for broader rights as though it were their science, their protocol. And that's just a note that while you can say one is the sponsor study and one is the investigator-initiated study, we do see the other parties becoming more aggressive and attempting to gain greater use rights than we used to see in the past.
For sure, that 100% the same. So next slide. These are just other examples. The responsibility for the data, the storage, the transmission, how is it going to be accessed? What kind of monitoring rights are there? What happens if there's an unintentional disclosure of data? I think this was the bottom piece was Duke's language, and Vanderbilt would tell Duke that we don't do anything immediately. These are all just the type of things that you have to think through. So we can bounce to the next slide. Breach reporting can be a really crazy thing. HIPAA's standard is 60 days, GDPR is 72 hours. The state of Tennessee used to tell us that they needed it in 24 hours, and we have whittled them down to 3 days, which is a more reasonable turnaround. I think Gavin had somebody who wanted 1 hour, which was truly crazy. I'd say about 5 days is typical for us and what we wind up agreeing to in a lot of our contracts.
Yeah. So we actually did have a contract where the other party required 1 hour turnaround, which obviously is impossible.
We don't know it happened in 1 hour.
Yeah. The other thing to think about in breach reporting is the definition of a breach. It's one thing, and you should work with your data security and compliance officers on this. It's one thing to say that your reporting obligation begins at breach. It's another thing to say that your reporting obligation begins at suspected or possible breach, right? Those are two separate things.
Yeah. And often separated in time by quite a lot. So I think that brings us to the end of the slides. And we can certainly go whatever direction anybody wants to go with questions or further thoughts or lines of investigation. So.
Well, thank you for that. Both Gavin and John, excellent. The information is very helpful. I'm seeing a lot of feedback in the Q&A. We got a whole bunch of questions to ask, time permitted. So we'll just kind of rapid fire them, and then Kirsten will tell us when to stop. I will put a plug in for OUP making this happen. So thank you very much to you and your colleagues, Kirsten, for getting this information out there, raising our collective level of understanding about these really important issues. So with that, there's a lot to discuss. So first off, we'll start with where we ended with the different types of agreements. Can you both this is for both Gavin and John, most of these, there's a few questions directed to individuals, but otherwise just assume they're for both of you. Can you further distinguish the difference in uses or needs between BAAs and DUAs? When is one needed over the other? You did touch upon that during the presentation, but maybe a few more words about it would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start, John, unless.
However,
So-
go for it.
Yeah, so HIPAA addresses different uses of data, right? And one use is research data, and one use is use of the data for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. So a data use agreement is for the transfer of a limited data set for research uses. That's the technical use of a data use agreement. A BAA is when a covered entity needs to send their PHI to a service provider to use that data to provide a service back to the covered entity. So an example would be if your institution needs to send from their healthcare operations, needs to send billing information out to another party. That party would sign a business associate agreement agreeing that the information they receive will be treated in accordance with the HIPAA requirements for business associates. So the rough breakdown is a DUA is usually seen and very common in research context, and a BAA is seen in business context.
Yeah, a BAA only ever exists in conjunction with the service agreement. It's not unlike a DUA, you don't get a standalone BAA. Although I have seen one where like the service agreement was basically a paragraph shoved into the beginning of the BAA. But
yep, perfect.
Now I will qualify my answer by one thing. You can see a BAA in a research context if the research entity, the covered entity, is sending data out to be de-identified. To be then.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Later use it for research. So you can, that is a business associate activity to de-identify data. So a covered entity can send it out to the outside party to be de-identified under a business associate agreement, then to have that de-identified data later used in research.
Right. So the de-identifying entity is not using it for research themselves, so the BAA is appropriate.
Correct.
Yeah, they're just performing a service on behalf of, yeah.
Okay. What is the IRB's role in the processing and execution of DUAs? Do they have a role? Perhaps if it's identifiable data?
Well, I'll give a quick answer, and John, you can.
Yeah, we can each take our turn. Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, if it's a DUA and it's a data use agreement, the term of art under HIPAA, it's a data use agreement, which would mean that you're transferring a limited data set, which is PHI, which is human subject data, which means the IRB has governance over that. So the IRB would have to review and approve that transfer that would be affected by the data use agreement. Now, if we use data use agreement in the generic form, not referencing a specific limited data set, so if you can use a data transfer agreement for the transfer of de-identified data, and depending on your institution, your IRB may or may not still want to review those proposed uses and transfers.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't have much to add other than to say that, yeah, we always, on any identifiable transfer, we always pull the informed consent, and that's part of what we review. And if we need assistance in interpreting a complicated situation, we involve the IRB in that matter.
John, you had mentioned the FTP data use agreement templates. Are those used with industry transfers as well, or just academic?
There's no prohibition on using them with industry, but they're really designed by academic partners for other academic partners, and Vanderbilt University Medical Center does not use them with industry partners. Now, that being said, the terms that are in the FTP DTUA template are very broadly acceptable, and we often have lifted language from it and modified or added to, and even with other collaborative projects that fall outside that template, like we are the administrator for the NIH's All of Us research hub, and we have about 1,000 participation agreements for that project. which include data use language. And we lifted a lot of that language from the FDP form because it is so widely accepted and a really good middle ground compromise on many things. So we steal from it all the time, even when we're not using it.
Okay, thank you. For both of you, there were several questions about managing data along with patient samples. Can you just provide a few words on how you do that? Is it one contract, two contracts? What are the complexities around both together?
Well, Alan, you know what our world is.
I know what our world is, but the rest of it, maybe Gavin. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, and then Gavin can say what if it's different in his universe. Yeah. So if samples are being transferred under an MTA and there's fully de-identified data that is associated with the samples and traveling with them, that all goes under the MTA. But if there's identifiable data, whether it's a limited data set or whether it's full-blown PHI beyond that, or whether it's data that is not directly associated with the samples, but maybe as part of the larger project, that would be a separate data use agreement in my office, and then Alan's office would have the MTA.
And I'll just jump in there. Part of the reason for that is at our institutions, we use MTA share. So we have a set of banked standardized documents to use for the MTAs. If you had to modify them to combine them with data use terms, then we'd have complexity because we couldn't use our automated system to do that. So have them as two separate contracts is a contractual efficiency, frankly. Sorry,
yes.
Gavin.
Yeah, just to add on, so HIPAA does not govern samples; it governs data. So to John's point, if if the materials don't have identified data going with them, then that makes it much easier, and that's outside the purview of HIPAA.
So Gavin, you actually predicted that there'd be some questions about these committees that you both run. One question that came up several times is, how do these committees impact cycle time? Are they more efficient, less efficient? How do you ensure that you're getting efficiency out of them?
I think they're way more efficient than like endless emails and trying to schedule phone calls. I mean, it's once a week, and everybody gets on one Zoom and we hash through it.
Yeah, I think efficiency can be in the eye of the beholder. So from the contracts office, we think it's more efficient. And it's certainly the result is better than not doing the project, right? So the complexity or the challenge is getting all your stakeholders together at the right time, and thus the creation of these committees, so that people have a standing obligation to participate to make sure that we can move research forward as fast as possible given the circumstances. But we do have complicated projects that come through our committees every now and then where we have to then defer to a later time and have the PI come in and explain some things to us.
Yeah, we try really hard to have the PI attend the initial meeting of the because they can often explain the science or answer technical questions, or just advocate for the overall importance of what they're doing. Because sometimes if it comes down to a business decision of should we do it, understanding the potential value of the project from the PI's perspective can be an important piece of that.
Right.
Yeah. Gavin, do you guys involve the PI in those regular meetings?
Yeah, the initial discussion, no, because at that point, my office would have already had discussions with the PI and we would have the data intake form. So we would submit the project to the data licensing committee for a discussion. If we think it's especially complicated, then we would engage the PI for the first meeting. Otherwise, they may be invited if we need a secondary meeting. Okay.
When you guys transfer data to third parties and it comes to the end of the contract term, do you have a preferred approach to destruction of data, returning data, how the data is handled after the research is complete?
So we have a contract provision that states the data will be either returned or destroyed at the discretion or direction of Duke. How that's done is affected by a different office, so I'm out of that piece of that, Alan.
Okay.
That's it. Our standard language is the same, and although I think we all live in the world, we know that data is never, ever really completely, totally destroyed. There's always a backup somewhere.
Right. I'm not sure how you're going to respond to this one. There's a question that arguably is in this webinar, or maybe it's better answered at the next one when we're talking about licensing of data. But I'll ask the question, what additional considerations are needed in industry contracts when you're sending data to companies? Because I guess in my world, it depends on the use of the data. If there's genuine research related use, perhaps that's through a data use agreement. To me, when I send data to companies, I'm trying to get paid for it. I try to do it through a license. Do you have any further insights into that, or how you distinguish between the two?
If we are sending data to a company, it's either because it's the company's protocol that they funded to conduct the research at Duke University and therefore have rights to the data, or it's a license. So I can't think of an instance where we would have a simple data transfer agreement to a company, because to me that means that company is using that independent of our institution. And again, it's either going to be research or a license.
Yeah, it would be really rare
Generally,
for
right,
something
and
not to fall into one of those buckets for us.
Right.
Okay. Can you say a few words about assessing the risk for images as a type of data?
We have very specialized people who do that for us, and we're happy that they exist.
Okay.
Yeah, images are hard because of the metadata embedded, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we go back to inquiring of the researchers whether data is de-identified or not, oftentimes when they say it's de-identified, there are images involved, and we looked at, there's no name or social security number on the image, but there's a header that gives certain information that could be used to identify the subject, right? So it's complicated with all the different layers of data that's embedded. So it is best left to experts. And I believe now there's actually commercial software available to help strip identifying information from images, but it's a subject all to itself due to the complexity.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Another subject that may be a question unto itself is around GDPR. And I know that you guys all deal with GDPR, and I know that there's complexity when you're working with a non-US entity. Can you, there was 4 or 5 different questions about GDPR that were asked, and I know that could be a whole new webinar, frankly, but could you talk a little bit about how you manage data when the transfer is with a non-US entity, or what are the GDPR related issues that you most focus on?
Well, I can tell you how we manage it from a contract perspective, and that's different than how we actually manage the data. That's an operational issue that's outside my wheelhouse. From a contract perspective, GDPR, it absolutely could be its own seminar or webinar. It's very complicated. It's lengthy. There are lots of rules. My office reaches out we have a central office that would be the hub of discussions amongst all of our stakeholder offices. So obviously the privacy office and compliance office will be involved. And we engage people that have the expertise on GDPR. And what we've seen is it's not just the GDPR terms that are not burdensome, but that we have to be attended to and complied with. It's the pages and pages in the contract of security terms that come with the GDPR terms. So, it's not uncommon for me to see a data security and privacy addendum that's 50 or 60 pages long. And a lot of times that will include the standard contractual clauses, but also data security requirements that, once again, are outside my office's expertise. We farm that out to another office for them to review and provide comments. But Alan, to your question, my office doesn't manage the actual operationalization of receiving data and making sure it's secure, but we negotiate the terms with our stakeholder offices to make sure that we can comply with what we've said we would do.
It's the same with us. Any GDPR related project is going to wind up involving our legal office, our international privacy office, and our IT security people, because the particular area of the investigator, we have to make sure that they are set up to be compliant with GDPR, as well as any additional data security terms that come with it. So all of those offices wind up being in the mix anytime from the very beginning. And we try to trigger that from the start, so that all of those things are happening more or less simultaneously.
Okay,
So
thank you.
I'm just going to mention here, Alan, so we had a lot of questions about GDPR on the last webinar as well. And so I think one of the things we're going to try to do for that Q&A webinar we mentioned is actually have someone who is expert on GDPR to be on that one as well. Because, you know, as both John and Gavin have already mentioned, it's complex and you have to have a whole host of people involved. So
I'll be listening in if you're going to do that.
Okay, so thank you for that, Kirsten. I have a very specific question. Someone's dealing with a particular issue, but I would encourage you both to think about it perhaps a little more broadly. It involves bringing data into an institution. We've been talking everything about sending data out. So and I'm presuming that you guys both work with data coming into the institution. The specific question was, are there any concerns or problems associated with sending out patient materials in exchange for a company analyzing them and using the results and then sending back data, where so your investigator wants data? Do either of you see any problems with that structure, or any concerns that you guys have had to deal with specifically around receiving data, how it's handled, what it's used for, things of that nature? I knew that'd be a little bit of a
Ellen, in your
take on it.
yeah, in your example, is it your example that was outgoing, right? Like we're sending data out to somebody to do something with, or sending samples to somebody, and then they're going to do something to them and then send us data back?
Well, the specific question, again, that was posed, not my question, is sending out materials and getting data from materials. You can imagine maybe there's someone who's doing sequencing and they're sharing the sequences back with us, and both parties could use that. But it's true for data as well. I mean, you could send out a data set and they could curate it in some way for research purposes and send it back. We were just, I think the question was more around what are the kind of the hurdles or pitfalls associated with receiving data from a third party, and what we can do with it. And maybe that's not, you know, a major part of what you've experienced, but I think that was the guise of the question.
Yeah. So if I understand the question, I'll give you a general answer, and that is, it's not uncommon to send materials out to a third party for them to do some sort of analysis, when you, and then return results back to you. At that point, we're viewing that company as a vendor. So the downstream or the data use rights or material use rights of that vendor would be extremely narrow, limited to the project for the benefit of our institution. I can imagine that there might be a collaboration. So a commercial company has, you know, an algorithm that you need, or some sort of platform that you need to use. You know, in that case, and this is highly fact dependent, so this is a general answer, we could send materials out to that company and have them perform some activity using those materials that creates data. And then what their rights would normally be limited to that research project if we characterize the research project as a collaboration, right? So that's, I mean, I hope I've provided at least a general answer to that fact pattern.
Yeah, and if I mean, we certainly have seen cases where, I mean, these are not normal things that I see all the time, but like where there's been overreach in that type of situation. Like I'm thinking of one case where we were engaging with another party. We were sending them data, and it was for quality and benchmarking type work. But they wanted, like, they didn't want to just do this for us and send us back what we were asking for. They wanted like permanent right forever to use the data for anything that they ever wanted to do. And we had to squash that. So we weren't going to go down that path. So, I mean, I think what you're saying is exactly right, that it's just figuring out what are the data rights that make sense given the nature of the relationship. Is it just purely a vendor? Is there more collaborative something going on?
Yeah. And I think maybe just one final comment on that is, I mean, we're going to see, and we're seeing more and more relationships with companies where they are a vendor and a research collaborator. And so they wear more than one hat, and we have to kind of address each of the use functions, you know, their service functions separate and distinct from their research function. And so that just makes contracting complex, certainly, but it can both be done in one fell swoop.
It keeps us employed, Alan.
Yeah.
Thus the reason for our escalation committees, Alan. And
Yes.
that's a prime example of what would be elevated to the licensing committee at Duke or John's.
Yeah,
escalation.
it would be the same. It would be like, are we going to do this? Are we good with this? Yeah. It's a kind of a should we question from a business angle.
Okay. So Kirsten, I'll ask one last question. This one's a long one, and this is in the Q&A if you want to actually follow along. It talks about the FDA templates for identified data, including representation that providers are compliant with NIST 800.122. And so I guess before we go on, is it safe to presume that both of you are familiar with NIST 800.122, the standards? Is that part of your realm of expertise?
It is not safe to assume that I am familiar with NIST. So that is my data security office.
Okay.
Same.
I would leverage. Yeah, when I see.
I have people I can call.
Okay, so that's actually the real question. The real question at the end of the day is which departments in your organization are responsible for that type of expertise?
IT security.
Right. IT security? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so it's when the data security addendum or language is normally cut as a whole and pasted into an email or sent the whole document to the data security office, because when you see penetration test and NIST and FSMA and SOC 2, that doesn't resonate with most contract negotiators, right? That's an expertise that lies in the data security office. So we'll farm that out for their review and comment.
Yeah, and at least in our world, we don't have one uniform computing environment across the entire medical center. There's a lot of variation in different areas and in what particular areas can comply with, and you really need somebody with a high level of IT expertise to look at not only what's being asked in the contract, but in this particular investigator's lab, in their department, in their area, do they have what is necessary to comply, or can they get there? Because it's not a simple answer.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, John and Gavin, for putting together such a terrific presentation, for answering all of these questions. As you can see from just the sheer number of questions that were in the Q&A, people have a lot of questions on this particular topic. I'm sure more questions will come in. That's part of the reason that we've added this Q&A session that will happen, I think, in a few months here on this topic as well, because there are just hopefully eventually more answers than questions on this topic, but it seems like they might be the reverse right now. Thank you, Alan, for being our guest moderator today, and Robin Racer also for connecting, both of you connecting us with Gavin and John to put this webinar together. Really appreciate your expertise. I think everyone out there learned a lot from everything that you had to say. And thank you to our audience. Actually, so many people have already stuck with us for over this hour topic. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second webinar in our series on patient data licensing. Please keep an eye out for the registration for our next webinar, which will be particularly on licensing considerations and patient data licenses. That'll happen in May. And we'll be sending that all out in LinkedIn and to our partner institutions, as we usually do. Anyone who's registered for these webinars will receive the information about the next webinars as well. In the meantime, everyone, take care of yourselves, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.